Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Gracias por acompañarnos a este seminario organizado por el Centro de Estudios sobre México y el Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos. Thank you for being here on behalf of the Center for Mexican Studies and the Institute for Latin American Studies. It is a pleasure to have you all here in the room, and also welcome and greetings to everybody that is watching this transmission in our Facebook Live. So it is we're in for a treat. We have a very special guest. But first of all, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tonga people. And to help us introduce our guest speaker today, we have Professor Fernando Perez-Montesinos, Associate Professor of History here at UCLA, and also author of the recently published book. Congratulations, Fernando. The Liberal State. The title of the book is Landscaping Indigenous Mexico, the Liberal State and Capitalism in the Purépecha Highlands, published by the University of Texas Press just a few weeks ago. So welcome, Fernando, and please introduce our guest.
Thank you, that's fun. Thank you very much for coming. I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And I'm very excited about this event. So Carlos Pérez Ricart is an assistant professor of international relations at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, CIDE, in Mexico City. Very importantly, between 2021 and 2024, he served as one of the 4 members of the Mexican Truth Commission, responsible for investigating human rights violations that occurred between 1965 and 1990. Pérez Ricart holds a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin and a degree in international relations from El Colegio de México, also in Mexico City. Prior to joining CIDE, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford between 2017 and 2020, working at both the History faculty and the Latin American Center, St. Anthony's College. His general research and teaching interests encompass the relationship between Mexico and the United States, security and organized crime, arms trafficking, drug policies, and the history of the Mexican police. His research has been published in renowned journals such as the Global Governance, the British Journal of Criminology, the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs, and a long list of very prominent journals. His most recent publications include the edited volume Gun Trafficking and Violence from the Global Network to the Local Security Challenge, published by Pale Grape in 2021. Crime, Violence, and Justice in Latin America, published by Routledge in 2022, and the book Cien, Años, Espías y Drogas, la historia de los agentes Antinarcóticos de Estados, Unidos, and México, published by Penguin Random House in 2022. Pérez Ricart is also a weekly columnist from the newspaper for the newspaper Reforma, and a contributor to Es la Hora de Opinar, a current affairs program in Mexico. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming here. Thanks so much, Fernando, and obviously Gaspar, for the invitation. I feel privileged to be here today, and I want to thank all of you for spending lunchtime with me on a Thursday today. So thanks so much. I'm very privileged to be here. As Fernando pointed out, I had the privilege to serve as one of the 4 commissioners of the Comisión para la Justicia y la Verdad de México between 2021 and 2024. And the aim of today's talk is to explain a little bit what was the commission about, which were the aims and the objectives of the commission, and to spend some time talking about the main findings of this report, which was published 5 months ago. I have to say, this is the first time I have the opportunity to talk about the report outside of Mexico. This is very much a neglected human rights report, even though it was a report which was encouraged and I would say paid by the Mexican state. It was not acknowledged, it was not recognized as a report. So I'm just waiting for the laptop. Just begin. This is the agenda of today's talk. First of all, I will talk about the Truth Commission. I will try to explain what's a Truth Commission about. I understand not everyone understands what a Truth Commission is. I don't have an idea what that was before joining the commission. I will talk about the specific Mexican commission. Then I will talk about how the commission was constituted in Mexico, what was the mechanism of historical clarification about, and I will go through the main research objectives and main findings of the report. So what's a Truth Commission? I am not sure if everyone here knows what a Truth Commission is about. There are four main features of a Truth Commission. First, a Truth Commission investigates a past history of violations of human rights in a particular country. I'm aware of the existence of 1995 different commissions across the world. Probably the most famous one is the South African one. In Latin America, we have many examples of Truth Commission. The Argentinian one being the most prominent, 1976 more or less, I think it was created. It worked for about 6 months. But in Mexico, it's the first time we had something similar as a Truth Commission. The second feature is that it is usually sponsored by the executive branch and less commonly by the legislative branch. It's not an NGO project, and it's not also an official project. It's something in between. It's encouraged and paid by the state, but it's not part of the state. It's sponsored by the executive branch. Most of the cases is not focused on a specific event and attempts to paint the overall picture of certain human rights abuses or violations over a period of time. In the case of South Africa, it was obviously the apartheid. In the case of Argentina, it was the military dictatorship. In the Mexican case, I will explain that later on. It's a period well known as the Dirty War, Guerra Sucia in Mexico, more or less between 1965 and 1990. And the fourth feature of a Truth Commission is that it exists temporarily and for a predefined period of time. So something between 6 months and 3 years. Next one, please. There are, of course, different Truth Commissions in our country. The South African being the most relevant one. The one in Guatemala that ended with the killing of the main leader of the commission, and many others. But for Mexico, is the first attempt to create a Truth Commissions for the Dirty War, the period 1965-1990. Next one, please. More importantly, what is not a Truth Commission? A Truth Commission is not a jurisdictional entity. They do not have judicial authority. Okay, so the idea was just to give account of human rights violations that happened over that period, but we were not a judicial authority. However, they are a consequence and a source of law. That meaning by that the judicial authorities might be able to take account of what we wrote for and take this as important findings by assessing the historical archives that can function as contextual backgrounds for prosecution and as a source of identification and signalizing of those responsible as an alternative to punitive justice. So has not the power to be a judicial authority, but it might be helpful for a second process of bringing justice to the victims. May I have here the I think it's so this is what the commissions are not and what they are actually work for. We believe that through the construction of certain narratives and the promotion of conceptions of social justice, obviously, Truth Commissions might be also helpful for the public. The commission that I will be talking about today was created in 2021. The complete name of the commission was Comisión para el Acceso a la Verdad, el Esclarecimiento Histórico y el Impulso a la Justicia de las Violaciones Graves a los derechos humanos cometidas entre 1965 and 1990. It was a very long title, also with broad aims. There were some precedents in the search for truth in Mexico. It's not the first attempt to address this period. There were a lot of attempts before our commission. The first one in 1997 with the Special Research Commission on the events of 1968. There was another one, a recommendation of the National Rights Commission in 2001. More importantly, in 2001, if people know here a little bit of Mexican history, contemporary history, might know about the Special Prosecution Office for Social and Political Movements from the past, the FEMOSP, created in 2001. And the Truth Commission of the State of Guerrero, localized in the state of Guerrero, one of the centers of human rights violations during that period in 2012.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So there are some relevant precedents for that, but the most relevant attempt to address that period was the commission that started in 2021 and ended its period in 2024. So let me talk a little bit about the periodo de Guerra Sucia. We didn't actually use the term Guerra Sucia. We prefer to talk about period of political violence from 1965 to 1990. A question that always comes when I talk about this is how was the period defined? Who defined the period? The answer is very simply that was the government which decided that. We participated in a call for being part of this commission, but the time period was defined by the state and was the result of a negotiation between victims, some perpetrators, and the state in general. But obviously, four disappearances happened before 1965 and has been happening after 1990. It's just the time frame that we had. Our mandate was just limited in these 25 years. May I have my bottle of water, please? So this was a period of political and state violence where a number of serious human rights violations were committed. How many, we don't know really well, and we won't know in the future, but most accounts are about 2,000 people were killed over this period for political reasons, okay? Obviously, when you compare this to the Argentinian dictatorship or the Chilean one, are not these very high numbers, but 2,000 to 2,500 killings is also a lot for that period, okay? Again, the mandate by presidential decree considers the dirty work comprises the years from 1965 to 1990. Nevertheless, which years the dirty work covers is still a matter of debate, and that's why we prefer not to use the term Guerra Sucia, but period of state violence. State forces of the Mexican government, in an attempt to contain political and social dissident movements, committed systematic and general violations. This is the main finding, obviously, and was also the premise of our work. And the Commission is an unprecedented effort whose objectives can be reduced to understanding strategies, responsible actors, causes, and the consequences of violence. Very importantly, the mandate was not about to study the complete period and also to study the strategies used by the guerrilla groups against the state. That was not part of our mandate. It was very clear to study human rights violations committed by the state. This is, for example, very different from the commission in Colombia, where they were aimed to study the complete period and try to identify perpetrators for both sides. This was not our mandate, so we didn't study the possible and probably also strategies of the guerrilla to commit also commit some sort of human rights violations against it. That was not part of our mandate, so we didn't study that at all. So if someone here is expecting me to talk about the teoría de los dos demonios and this sort of stuff, this was not part of the mandate of the commission. I have a personal opinion of that, but we might be able to talk about this later on, but was not part of what we actually study here. This is the story of a relevant attempt to provide some truth and to provide at least some justice to the victims, but I'm not sure this is a successful attempt. I'm being here talking about an attempt that failed very much because of the structural organization of the Mexican state and how the commission was created. It was also a failure of some important appointees that didn't want the success of the commission, and I will also acknowledge some failures of the own commissioners over this period. But I'm not talking here about a successful attempt. I'm just talking about an attempt that had some success, because at the end of the period, we managed to create an own report, more than 5,000 pages. So there is a report, but obviously the aims and the objectives of the commission were not. We were not allowed to finish them. So how was the commission constituted? You can see here there were many relevant people at the state: the head of the Subsecretario de Gobernación, the head of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the head of Ministry of Finance and Public Credit, the head of the National General Archive, the head of the CEAF, which is the Executive Commission for Victim Attention, and the head of National Research Commission, which were public functionaries, bureaucrats, and 4 expert commissioners. Okay, we all were sit down in a table, but we have only 1 vote from 7 different people that were actually in the table. We have voice, but we actually had 1 vote. Probably our mistake was to accept these conditions before entering to this commission, but this was not under discussion when we accept to be part of the commission. But just for all of you to know, we were 4 the expert commissioners with just 1 vote, and we had to share the responsibilities with people that were actually part of the state. We were not paid for doing this work. I continue doing my work as assistant professor at CIDE. David Fernando is a priest, a very well recognized priest, a Jesuit priest. Abel Barrera is a human rights advocate in Tlachinola in Guerrero, and Eugenia Alier is an historian that also continued her teaching and research at UNAM over this period. We were able to hire around 40 people that work with us to create the informe. They were paid. They were paid by the Secretaría de Gobernación, not as we were. And they were, I would argue, a very good mix of anthropologists, historians, political scientists, and scholars that work really hard on their very precarious conditions to get along with the commission. We worked for about 2.5 years, and at the end, we were able to produce the informe that I will talk about later on. So I'm here with Abel Barrera, with David Fernández-Dávalos. Eugenia is not there, but this is one of the many pictures that we took when we started our work in 2022. So the commission had actually 5 different parts. One very specific was the mechanisms for the truth and historical clarification. The 4 of us were responsible just for that part, for the mechanism for the truth and historical clarification. And the commission had also other access, other parts. One was a special research plan for those who were disappeared between that period. So a special plan to look for them, which people which were disappeared, about 1,300 people that are acknowledged by the state that are disappeared. A special plan for reparation and compensation for those who were victims of that period. Some actions for memory and guarantees of non-recurrence. And there was also a plan of justice for these people, which actually didn't take place at all. From these 5 parts, including the justice one, the only part of the commission that actually worked was the mechanism for the truth and historical clarifications, due to bureaucratic problems and so on. The other 4 parts of the commission didn't provide any meaningful results, and this was actually one of the things why the victims weren't very happy when we presented to them the report. Okay, but again, this was not part of our mandate. our mandate was to write a reform for truth and historical clarification from 1965 to 1990. I knew about of these limits. I was aware that in many senses we were just a granito de arena trying to help and so on. But I still believe that even 3 years after beginning this work, that this was an unprecedented opportunity, a turning point in the investigation of our recent past that not only has retrospective effects, but also allow us to understand the conditions that enable serious human rights violations in the present. We like to say that this was not just an historical work. I'm not. I didn't study history. I'm a political scientist. But I'm well convinced that the past has a lot to say to understand our present. So by looking at the past, this was my aim, we would be able to understand a little bit about violence in Mexico nowadays. That was the reason why I entered into this. And I think that at the end, when you look at the report, you will see that it's true that the impunity from yesterday is what allows the impunity of today in contemporary Mexico. The main objectives of the mechanism of historical clarification was obviously to clarify and communicate political violence dynamics of the recent past, build a narrative that vindicates the victims of the period, to elaborate a narrative that recognizes and explains cause and consequences of such events, and improve the understanding of the past to confront present violence. What we find when we started doing this work was that very few people in Mexico knew what happened over that period from 1965 to 1990. When I ask you, and I'm informed that here are experts in Mexico about moments and events of human rights violation in Mexico, I'm pretty sure that you will tell me two of them, two very prominent ones. 1968, 2 de octubre 1968, Matanza de Tlatelolco. And which other one? 1971, El Halconazo. Junio 1971, 1970. But if I ask you a third event of that period, I'm aware that most of you will have problems telling me a massacre, a moment in which the state or members of the state killed people. Am I right? Or do you think that you would be able to tell me about any other moment of it? So we were aware that very much the dirty work, these 25 years of state violence, were somehow obscured by these two periods, 1968 and 1971. They were seen as paradigmatic moments of state violence. But besides these two periods, we knew very little about that. At the end of the report, what we discovered are 48 massacres that occurred over this period. This is one of the main findings of the period, including some like Montechila in Puebla, 1970, more than 50 campesinos killed by the Mexican state. This is not part of the narrative of the construction of the modern state. This is not part of obviously of the study programs at the universities and high schools in Mexico. This is not part of our understanding of how the Mexican forces used to work over that period. So one of our ideas is just to communicate violence dynamics, not just with scholars and political scientists, but also beyond that. And I think that in those terms, our report was successful in terms of clarifying that, discovering that, and doing some sort of research about that. Obviously, it's not the end of that, as you might know, but I think we were able to find some paths into those periods beyond 1968 and 1971. What was our research about? One of the main relevant things about the report, and I would argue this is the takeaway of this talk, is that this report is not just about a context or an implementation of strategies of counterinsurgency take place. Most reports of truth commissions in Latin America and beyond Latin America are about guerrilla and political groups that were distant to the state, right? When you think about the Argentinian report, you think about how the state actually wanted to kill those that armed in order to fight the state. It was also the same case in Colombia, in Peru, with Sendero Luminoso. This report goes beyond this understanding of dissidents and this understanding enemy. So obviously, one part of the report is about how the state uses its power to fight guerrilla groups, Partido de los Pobres, all the movimientos revolucionarios of that period. But our report goes a little bit beyond that. There are many reasons for that, but most importantly, that is that we know and we still know very little about all other sort of repression against dissidents, student movements, urban popular movements, labor and union movements, political parties, democratic political parties like the PRD, for instance, also the LGTB plus within the armed forces and political entities, and against human rights defenders. Obviously, these are, in a sense, also political groups, but not the guerrilla groups that are normally the ones that are studied in such a report. We also studied repression against communities that opposed to the implementation of public policies, that were opposed against the construction of a highway or a bridge in a particular moment, and were repressed, were killed, were tortured by state agents over that period. And by doing that, I would argue here, we open a new path for research for contemporary history. There was very little about this before this report, and after writing this report, I think we opened some sort of path for investigating human rights violations, not just against the guerrilla group, but also against other sort of dissidences that were till 3 or 4 years ago very much neglected by Mexican history. So since I want to save time just for the Q&A, I will go through explaining you what we actually did, and going through the main findings. We had mainly two ways of doing this work. One part of it was by interviewing people of that period, people that suffered human rights violations, and also families of them, and colectivos, and people that did know a little bit about what happened over that period. We were able to interview around 1,300 different people. You have to consider that these were rather old people, since we're studying human rights violations from 1965 to 1990, and we were able to go probably across most of the country with very scarce resources. Even though we did receive some money from the state, it was super complicated to be able to complete field trips across Mexico. Most importantly, we tried to focus not just on interviewing people that were part of the guerrillas, but also people that were never interviewed by any other commission and any other report in the past. People that suffer torture by I say police and so across the country. More than again 1,300 interviews across the country. Here you can see some of these pictures. Some interviews were like 2 days, 3 days long, some 30-35 minutes, but I think we were able to go to every corner in Mexico where there were people that wanted to talk to us. We were able to record them and transcribe them, and this is part of the archive of the mechanism of the mechanisms that in a few months or years will be open to the public. So the report, the work of the commission was not just the report, but also to provide students, to provide investigators the opportunity to go through these interviews, to go through these recordings, and to reconstruct, challenge, and dispute the narratives that we were actually able to construct here. No? Some of the peers, for instance, Don Elizalde here, it was a victim of Operación Cóndor. Operación Cóndor, the Mexican one, not the South American one, in Sinaloa, Durango, and Sonora. One of the things that we actually did here is to try to understand the connection between the Guerra Sucia, the dirty war, and the war on drugs. And the Operación Cóndor is at the middle of that, the period in which the army went to different parts of the country in order to eradicate amapola and marijuana, but by doing that, they were actually trying to kill some guerrilleros and also to keep part of the renta de la droga, right? The Operación Cóndor, until this report was barely studied, and we and we were able to publish 506 pages, 600 pages of what actually happened over Operation Condor by interviewing many of them, some people that were disappeared or that suffered torture and wanted to talk with us then. So it's one of the main findings of that. We also obviously went through archives. We had the possibility to study more than 97 archives throughout the country. Obviously, the AGN being the most relevant one, the Archivo General de la Nación. But we were able to go through public and private archives across the country. Here you can see some pictures of that. And also the Archivo de Concentración de la Sedena. To my knowledge, there was not any researchers or entity that was able to go through the Archivo de Concentración de la Sedena. The Archivo de Concentración is this archive that is between the historical archives and the actual paperwork is very much in the middle, and we were able to enter into these archives and looking for the plans in the 1970s, 1960s, and so on. This is relevant. I want to point that out because this was the reason why in 2023 we were asked to leave the archive, since the army discovered that we were actually discovering important stuff in the Archivo de Concentración, and this was the first confrontation that we had with the federal government in 2023. And one of the reasons why at the end our report was not acknowledged and was neglected by the Mexican state because of the Archivo de Concentración. But we were able to go through the archive for 8-9 months in 2022, 2023. And all of this is also part also of the repositorio of the Mecanismo de Esclarecimiento Histórico that we aim to get open for researchers and so on. This is on the federal level, but we also had the chance to, for instance, to study the Archivo Histórico de la Ciudad de México, or the Archivo del Poder Judicial de Chiapas, the Archivo del Poder Judicial de la Ciudad de México, some subnational archives that have not been researched for anybody, and we were able to enter into these archives and to get some important information. As you might know, there is no history of the Mexican police at all in Mexico because we don't have archives of the police in Mexico at all, or archivos de la Procuraduría. We don't have anything like that. But we had some local state archives that were analyzed by our researchers. So also a takeaway of this talk that very relevant is the report, but most relevant than that is that we were able to advance a lot of gestiones in order to get into local and state archives. So this is also part of the process. It's not a product, but it's also a process that might be important or relevant for scholars across Mexico and Latin America. And I think that this report will inform a lot about how a repressive government actually works, how the police used to work, how the army used to work, and to admit that the army, even though the army was a very relevant actor in perpetrating violence, was not by no means the most relevant. It was the most relevant one, but not the only one. You can see how human rights violations were executed by state police, for instance, in Chiapas. We discovered that the Policía Estatal de Chiapas between 1986 and 1992 was actually prosecuting lesbianas and transsexuals, murdering 23 different people over that period, just because we don't know really why, but they had really targeted sexual dissidents in Chiapas over that period. Nobody knew about this, and so some of the things that we actually discovered in the case of Chiapas, and all of these human rights violations were perpetrated by the Policía Municipal de Tuxtla Gutiérrez. The Policía Municipal of Tuxtla Gutiérrez was never part of the map, of the roadmap of the Mexican repression, right? But we discovered that it actually was part of it. No? One of the findings, I'm going too fast, but one of the findings that we had is actually that when the DFS disappeared, the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, which was the center of the core of the Mexican repression, once that was disappeared, the agents didn't disappear, right? They keep living, and they went into the state police in Mexico. Tuxtla Gutiérrez was one of the cases, Tamaulipas, and then after some years, they were actually being part of organized crime organizations. So you can disband an organization, you can close a bureaucracy that was part of the repression, but those that were part of it actually went to other different police force in Mexico. So one of the things that we discovered here is that we have to analyze repression not just on a federal level, but also to understand the subnational dynamics of that. So here you can see some of the archives that we visited throughout the research. Some are usual suspects when you study human rights in Mexico, but some are not. For instance, the PRD archive. One of the main parts of this is to identify the killing of 62 militants of the PRD in the period 1988-1994. This is the only case in which we went a little bit beyond our mandate, and we were able to identify also the period of Salinas de Gortari till 1995-1996 by discovering a systematic attempt to kill and to disappear Perredistas in Mexico, which is was the left party, the left alternative in Mexico. We call the disappearance and killing of these PRD members as the Tlatelolco in Cámara Lenta, because they were not just killed in a single day. They were actually killed in several years, but in a very systematic and generous way. No? So you can see here some of the archives. Of course, you might have plenty of questions, but the report is obviously open for all of you and available in internet. Over these years, we entered also to military facilities. For the first time, researchers were able to enter into military facilities to try to understand and to identify centers of clandestine detention in Mexico and torture. And this was the first time in which victims and scholars went into them, and we identified 2 spots where people were disappeared and killed in 1971 and 72 in Oaxaca, Sinaloa, and Guerrero. So let me talk a little bit about the collection for el Estado, which I was responsible for, with Abel Barrera and David Fernandez Dávalos. Just some ideas of how this was constructed. This is a collection. This is a report. Overall, has more than 5,000 pages. As I said, it's constructed in five different questions. The first is what happened. Facts and consequences of violations of human rights. What happened to construct a narrative of that? A second part is about the causes. Why did it happen? Right? To try to explain the conditions that enabled that to happen. A third part, who were responsible for that? Who were the perpetrators? We also were able to talk to perpetrators of that. That wasn't easy at all, but throughout some Facebook pages and some networks, we had the opportunity to talk to some perpetrators. There were a lot of ethical questions about how to deal with the fact that we were talking to perpetrators. But when talking with other members of truth commissions across Latin America, we were told that by talking to the perpetrators, you will have more possibilities and probabilities of knowing about where the disappearances really are, and to reconstruct the criminal networks that used to work. So at the end, we decided that we would be able to talk to them, and we talked to them. Many of these interviews were obviously private and anonymized, but this was very important to the success of the report, and for this particular part of the report, why it happened. Then, who were responsible? We have a list from 500 people that were individual perpetrators and obviously institutions. More importantly, and that was also part that was disputed by the government, they told us that we went beyond our mandate by having a specific part of the factors of persistence. Why does it happen? Why does it continue to happen? Which was actually the main question why I actually started my work on the commission. I want to understand the bridges between the past and the present, so we have a part of the factors of persistence between that period and contemporary Mexico, and a part on recommendations, how to avoid it from keep happening, Also, the presidency told us that this was also beyond our mandate, and this was also one of the reasons that why they didn't recognize our report. But we thought about it, and we thought that it was important to keep also this part in the report, and that's what actually we did. Very quickly, again, the volumen 1, if you want to have just a panorama, an outlook of the report, I recommend you just to go to the volumen 1, resumen, conclusiones y recomendaciones, no longer than 200 pages, available in internet. I will give you in a few moments the web page. Then four different volumes on los hechos, casos de afectaciones y consecuencias, causas políticas, económicas y socioculturales, perpetradores e instituciones, factores de persistencia, and the annexos, all the documents that support the informe. My aim was to come today with the informe, but I wasn't allowed to bring so many books in the airplane. But I promise I will give just an example of that to the library of the university. I promise to do that in the short future. So this is what we did. Abel, David, and myself. We had as in any other commission, a problem between the commissioners. So there are two different collections. One of them is the one I'm speaking about here, which is Fue el Estado. The other one was written by the work of Eugenia Alier, which was more the political part of it. So, but the stuff that you will find in this collection for el Estado is the study of these 11 different groups of victims that were identified. Peasants, indigenous, and Afro-Mexican communities in the context of territorial control, agrarian struggle, and counterinsurgency. Communities that opposed to development public policies. Populations that inhabited zones where counter-narcotic strategies were deployed. Marginalized and criminalized populations. Members of the armed forces and police sectors that were actually committed by the members of the army. So between the army, political party dissidences, urban popular movements, gender-based dissidents, religious dissidents, journalists, and Guatemalan refugees, that people that went to Mexico in the 1980s and then were subject of human rights violations by the Mexican state and by the Guatemalan state in Mexican soil over that period, something that had been somehow studied, but I think we have very strong research on that as well. Victoria Alier and her collection includes political military organizations, student movements, labor union movements, and the support networks against repression, that as her own work, and we are not responsible of that, I think it deserves to be read as well. These are the overall numbers of the report. In total, we conducted 149 different field work trips across Mexico. This is grown. At the end, were 1,300 people that presented their testimony, 97 archives consulted, and 8,594 victims identified by just in this context that were studied in this collection. We also studied the number of people that were forcibly displaced over this period, over 123,000 people, and more than 500 perpetrators identified. Here are some of the cases that we studied. I don't want to spend much time in that. I spoke about Montechila, for instance, more than 50 people that were killed. Matanza del Río Tula, not in the history books, not in the main narrative of Mexico. 12 to 14 people that were disappeared, tortured, and executed. Particular cases of this one terrible case of Teniente Irineo Gutierrez Santana. He was a médico sanitario in the army. He refused to torture some people which were part of the army, and because of that, he was then tortured by their mandos in Mexico. This is a terrible case of this guy. We were able to talk to their family. And the execution against militants on the PRD, 12 in 1988, 20 in 1989, 60 in 1990, and 572 between 1991 and 2002. So here the Mexican state told us, hey, you are not allowed to study beyond 1990, right? But then we thought, okay, how is that possible? Obviously, this is part of our same process, and we went through that. We studied that, and they weren't very happy about it. Here are the numbers from like human rights from the different contexts, and the number of victims. For instance, for political party dissidents, 2,600 victims. Urban popular movement, 1,031. Journalists, refugees, members of armed forces, religious dissidents. All of these numbers you can see them in the report. These are the violations that we identify: arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, extrajudicial execution, transitory forced disappearances, massacres, sexual tortures, exile, sexual violence, reproductive violence. We had a very strong methodological team that allowed us to identify very well which sort of violence people suffer over that time. We also had the possibility to study this across Mexico. Obviously, Guerrero was an important part of that, but also Chiapas, Sinaloa. Here you can see some evidence that violations occurred across the country, and not just in a few spots, as the main narrative has always said. Also, very importantly, when people that know about this think about the dirty war, they will point out 1971 to 1974 as the main moments of the dirty war. After our report, we find out that actually the early 80s were especially hard for dissidents in Mexico. 1982, 1983, 1984 were years in which actually a lot of disappearance and torture actually occurred. So by trying to do this exercise, we're challenging many of the assumptions of that period in Mexico. I'm finishing, okay? Sorry for going so fast. I wrote down 12 main pieces of the work just to finish a sort of conclusion. I wrote them down just to be clear about that, and this might be able to be discussed later on. But I think these are the 12 main pieces of today's talk and of the complete archive. And I think the report, and I think this worked very well as a conclusion, right? First of all, the Mexican state is responsible for the serious violations of human rights in the period from 1965 to 1990 in distinct contexts of violence. State violence was operationalized and is instrumentalized in a systematic and generalized manner. Second, violence was executed against classic and orthodox insurgency movements. Of course, we knew that. As much as against a wide range of dissident communities with diverse characteristics, which suffer specific violence within counterinsurgent strategies. Okay. Third, the state repressed, persecuted, punished, disciplines, and co-opted political and social dissidents that, by questioning the state's hegemony and contending for the democratization of the country, were identified as a danger. Fourth, institutional arrangements created and sustained by the counterinsurgent state had two main objectives. First, to guarantee its political security, its survival, and the continuity of an hegemonic party based on a post-revolutionary model. And second, to ensure the reproduction of a capitalist, developmental, and extractivist model. The state encouraged and consented human rights violations practices, as well as the formation of criminal circuits of extortion, corruption, and impunity. Responsibilities attributed to the Mexican armed forces, representatives of the executive power, local police, and a number of state organisms which functions and nature had no relation whatsoever with the use of violence, such as the National Institute of Migration, probably the worst bureaucracy in Mexico, and the Supreme Court of Justice. In the international realm, these violations also implicated foreign security and intelligence agencies of these countries. We had a special part on studying the work of the CIDE and the DA in terms of helping Mexican bureaucracies to commit human rights violations in Mexico. 7. Some members of military forces, judicial agents, and police officers were instructed in counterinsurgent techniques. Many of them later found a place in the ranks of organized crime. Inside these groups, actors have been replicated the training received and have shaped the logic of paramilitarism. 8. Counterinsurgent practices migrated to other contexts of political violence. Practices were instrumentalized by members of security and intelligence corporations, enabling the continuity of serious violations of human rights in a persistent manner. 9. In spite of efforts conducted towards the professionalization of security units following 1990, the armed forces continued to have a central role inside the political system, which has granted them with opportunities to continue with serious violations of human rights accompanied by an institutional structure of impunity. One of the reasons why the report was not acknowledged. 10. Actors that would be responsible for the prosecution and implementation of justice have maintained irrespective from these transformations, which has limited the mechanisms of access and guarantee of justice and non-repetition. 11. Efforts surrounding through and memory that precede the commissions were the result of years of claims and resistance from organized victims that demanded justice. Nevertheless, institutional rigidity and lack of political will towards recognizing and repairing violations of human rights constitutes a factor of persistence and impedes reaching guarantees of no repetition. To more, the creation of the National Human Rights Commission in the 1990s marked a significant progress. However, a lack of diligence and reluctance from institutions responsible to accept the recommendations stipulated and bring to justice perpetrators have contributed to factors of persistence. And last one, institutional reluctance was one of the biggest challenges we faced as a commission. The denial, hindering, obstruction, destruction of historical documentation that were of interest, and complete disregard for the presidential decree that created the commission constituted attempts by security and intelligence institutions to conceal the truth and contribute to the persistence of impunity. Thanks so much of it. And here is the webpage where you can actually download the complete report and confront a dispute and challenge our main thesis. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
The Q&A.
Yeah, sorry.
So before we get to the Q&A quickly, I just want to acknowledge that this is indeed an unprecedented report. And part of the reasons why I invited Carlos is because I learned about the report through a close friend, not because I learned about the report on the news in Mexico, not because I was going over the newspapers and found that there was a human rights report finally in Mexico. I found out about the report through one of the researchers that worked with Carlos. I won't name her name because probably it won't help her in Mexico, but I really want to thank that person for essentially pointing me to Carlos's and everyone's report. As I was going over the report, and I was truly horrified about the hundreds and then thousands of different cases of human rights violations in Mexico during 1965 and 1990. I felt really compelled to share this study because part of the consequences of the Truth Commission's report is that the systematic also denial of the findings of the report. Carlos can speak to it in a moment, but this report has not found really a lot of audiences in Mexico. So I felt compelled after reading parts of the report to give the commission and the report a platform so it can at least be known in places like UCLA and through UCLA with all the resources and means that we have, although limited, other people can learn about this amazing work of research. So I will just quickly ask you one question and then open it to everyone in the room. So you mentioned that there is a second report, if you will. So can you talk us a little bit why there was some sort of contentious between one of the commissioners and the other part of the commissioners. I do appreciate that you said clearly that everyone should also read that part of the report. It's also a wonderful piece of research. But I want you to talk us through the tensions that sort of by the end of the report ended up in this kind of a division between the commissioners.
In these sort of processes and in these sort of bodies, when you work with peers, we're four of us. It's also always complicated to come to terms. When you come to different backgrounds, when you contrast ideas, you don't always come to terms. And that's why we decided at some point that three of us would work together with the same methodological basis, with the same definitions, concepts, and Eugenia would work along with her own definitions and understanding of the work. So we distributed the work, not by saying that her parts are less or more relevant, but we also decided that we wanted to have a single report, just a one, in two different collections with different with two different understandings of what we were talking about. I don't want to go deeper into the reasons why it happened, about the tensions. When you have almost daily meetings with the other commissions, always super difficult. And I was aware that in all commissions, same problems always arise. So that was but let me give you an example of this. For instance, I'm not comfortable with using the term genocide. For instance, when you talk about Tlatelolco massacre in 1968, for me it's very difficult to understand that particular period as a genocide. For her was not the case, so she actually uses the term genocide for describing what happened there. I don't agree with that, and in the same way, she didn't agree with many of the terms and concepts we actually use. But again, it was not a personal stuff. It was different ways of reading history. And again, in all commissions, this sort of stuff arises, and I really encourage all of you to read also that part of the report. I think that in many senses they are complementary. And it gives also another outlook of that period. I would argue 95% of the things we actually agreed with. In 5% of the stuff we didn't agree, and it's a shame that because of that 5%, we were not able to present all of this just as one single report. But I think it has to be read as well.
Thank you, Carlos. So now, questions.
Really, thank you so much for being here. It's really, really great that we're able to release it. I had a question about your definition of the state and state action, because you're later in one of the points at the end, you refer to people who entered the paramilitares. And what I guess wasn't completely clear to me is the events that you're talking about, the murders, the actions. Are those committed by people who are themselves officers of the state, or are you also including people who might be in the halcones or some other group, or who might be an off-duty police officer in one of these other groups? Do you draw a line? How broad is your definition of the state? That's my question.
This is an excellent question, and this was also a matter of disputes at the commission. I understand that period of Compromise Knight's understanding of state in terms that the Mexican state over that period was a sort of queso gruyere, like a queso gruyere in which you have a lot of oils in the queso, and it was not well organized. It was less organized than we actually think it was. We refer here to state actors in the sense that state actors, officials, even if they are local of the state, were part of these human rights violations. But we don't include here cases in which we don't find the connection between them and the paramilitary groups. So we just accounted for human rights violations committed by state actors, even though they are just at the municipal level or local level or state level. But yeah, we refer exclusively to state actors, right? So this was like the baseline for all our units. But for instance, we know a lot of cases in which paramilitary groups were part of them, or they were encouraged, or state actors encourage other people to commit. We didn't include that because we didn't have the proof that happened, even though we have many ideas now. But we were very, I would argue, very serious about that, about not about trying to identify the cause, the network, the mechanisms in which state actors were part of it. If we didn't find that out, we didn't include that, even though we do talk a little bit about that, but we refer exclusively, for instance, it's the 46 massacres that we identified here, 86 ones, were committed by state actors. Okay, there was no sort of blur line of that state actors identified, and we included the names of them in most cases.
Thank you.
But yeah.
Thank you, Carlos, for bringing these issues to the forefront of our discussion. I have many questions, but I wanted to get your insight specifically about what you're thinking about the armed forces in Mexico. And specifically, I mean, I don't know what is your insight, but were the armed forces completely following the lead of the elected officials of the political part? Or in a sense, were they also acting as sources of power? And I'm just wondering, I mean, there are many, not only political repression, but you mentioned also the 1960s, 1970s version to the drug war. And of course, extrapolating more to the Ayotzinapa, with, you know, like, what insights did you get? And also because in terms of the political decision to create a commission, there was some political capital there.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, you got a lot of pushback. Was that, you know, an indicator of the power of the armed forces?
You're right, as part of that.
I'm just speculating here, and I wonder if you have any insights of that.
So, in two ways. Even though the armed forces are the most vertically integrated organization in Mexico, they have been always. What we discovered throughout this report is that they actually didn't work as a monolithical actor, as we actually thought about. So they were more pieces there than what actually we thought about. The zonas regionales, for instance, had a lot of power. They not always receive clear mandates from the center. And obviously they didn't always follow the lead from the presidency. They were really autonomous in many senses. And inside the military forces, there was also a lot of groups inside that. I think our report informed us a lot about how they actually work over that time and how many local powers were actually created in order to make money, to gain power in different regions. For instance, the one in Sinaloa, Sonora, Durango, didn't provide information to the one in the center. They have much contact on that. They were very much autonomous over that time. I think that if scholars follow this lead, they will find out a lot about how they actually worked. What we discover is that the information we have about them is very scarce. Just a few books on that, and not as well informed as we thought it was. So I think this report is also relevant for those studying the armed forces. From the second part of the question, one of the elements why we were able to finish going through the Archivo de Concentración is because they still have plenty of power, as we could see in the Ayotzinapa case, but also in the past. And we discovered in 2023 that the cell phone of Alejandro Encinas, which was actually the acting director of the commission, was spied by the army over that time. So at that point, we stopped communications with them, and we didn't finish our work. We published. Let me finish with that. We published 2 small books on how the army actually tried to disrupt our research, with all the evidence about that. They were published last year, 2 reports in our webpage. You can see them, where you can see that once our researchers went to the archives one day, for instance, they found an archive with a piece of archive with 300 pages. The next day, when they asked for the same piece, that had only 25 pages or so on. So we were able to document and to describe the efforts of the army to disrupt our work as a commissioner, even though we were actually commissioned by the presidency to do this work. So you had these two axes, right? At what point they were actually saying, hey, you cannot do this and you cannot do this research because this goes beyond your mandates. And on the other part, you have apparently the support of the president to do this work. At the end, that tension was too strong, and we didn't finish our work there. But obviously, this was the Muro Verde, as we talked. The Muro Verde was the main reason why we didn't, why we were not able to finish that. And if in a commission like this that's finished in 1990, you have so much disruption and so much provision to go further on. You cannot imagine what happened when you study the period beyond 1990, right? When you study contemporary issues, the dispute it's obviously more strong.
Muchísimas gracias. This was great and it's so important. I was really interested in the interviews, so I would love to learn more about the structure, the questions that were asked. I know that you all had very strict parameters that you had to work within, but I'm also really interested in how these human rights violations follow the victims, survivors, and how it impacts their family members if they're not with us today.
As a commissioner, I have to say I didn't conduct any interview. My team was responsible for that. I can tell you 2-3 things about that. First, we tried to be really serious and very strong in methodological terms in how to do this. It obviously always in safe conditions, trying to guarantee confidentiality when they wanted to do so. And I can tell this after that time that it was too muy fuerte for our research, even though they were trained for doing that. They didn't expect this sort of speeches and this sort of discourse and this sort of facts. Normally we do try to get this done in 2 hours time, but at the end, most of them, I think, took 5-6 hours time. It was impressive how much they had to say for the past time. So from the 1,300 interviews that I actually took, probably 3/4 of them took for the first time with someone about this period. Many of them were not with the idea that they were victims of different stuff. So they didn't feel victims, that they were victims of forced ¿cómo se llama este? When you have to go to other place, when you forced displacement. But no, the police came here but they identify with the fact that they were displaced. For instance, in Guerrero, and I think this is a very nice example of this. In Guerrero, it has been analyzed how the army came to different communities. They tortured men. They put many of them in jail. But no one, until our report, identified and talk about the women that stayed there. What happened to them? Were they victims or not? Many of them were forced to get pregnant with men of the military. Many of them were forced to marry them. Many of them were sexually assaulted. And no one till yet has acknowledged the fact that they were actually victims or they were not indirect victims of that, where they were actually victims of the solid. They were not collateral, they were party, right? So by talking to them, some people that were actually familiars of victims, when talking to them, we identified that they were actually victims, direct victims of that, no? So we were not prepared for that at all, even though our researchers were trained. At the end, they could not understand that. If I could go the time again, starting again in 2021, this would be one of the issues which I think could have been done better in terms of training, in terms of psychological preparation in order to conduct this interview. If you're interested in this, I really recommend you to read the first part of the archive when we describe the methodological approach to conduct these interviews, but we were not prepared at all. No one is prepared to conduct these interviews and to try to conduct a commission like this, okay? So we failed in a lot of things at the very beginning, and we give account of all the stages also in the report. Kevin.
Yeah, I have to go to another appointment, but before I leave, I just wanted to thank you for bringing this to us here. I wanted to commend you for the courage that you had to serve on this commission with the others. I mean, it must have been some serious concern of you and your family. And I wonder if you have any idea of writing a book about this experience. That might be another way of bringing it to international attention.
I'm not thinking about, like, to be honest, after finishing this, I went back to my research and to the stuff I really know about. I felt like completely burned out from this. Because you can let me share with you this reflection. You cannot win when studying these issues. There is not a win for you in any terms, with the victims, with the families, with your peers, with the public. There is a win because there is so much tanto dolor into this story that it's not a public win at all. So at the end, we didn't come to terms with the families, with the victims, with among the commissioners, among the groups was so problematic, right? And the fact that the report was not recognized by the presidency, that was not recognized by the state, obviously was really hard for us, no? But now, when we're talking with you today, and I thank you, Fernando, Gaspar, for the opportunity, I more and more understand that it was not a report for the present. It was not a report for this time, it's a report for the future, right? And we'll be reading it in the future as a cornerstone, as part, an important part for human rights in Mexico. And I really think that while we were able to identify a lot of stuff in the archive, and in the report, are the young generations and the researchers and the scholars that will really give back the value to this report by following the piece of the path that we actually put them down. So it's a report that I think will get more and more attention through the years. Not now, it's not the time for this, but through the years, I think that people will really give some sort of, like you are doing now, acknowledging the stuff that is here written, and the fact that I'm here in LA today with you, I think is a piece of it. So I don't want to write a book of that, but what I had to do is reading them in 5,000 pages, and again, it's not for today, it's for the future. Thanks for
you've done is you've created a massive database for further
the database is there, the graphics are there, and more importantly, the transcriptions of people that want to talk with anyone else more are there. The archives that were opened, the private and public archives that were opened. I think that I'm being here muy presumido, right? But I think this will be helpful. And the fact that we study not just political dissidencies and contra-guerrilla, but also study all these other broad actors that were also subject of human rights violations. I think that in the Mexican case, and you will tell me what you think about this, will make a difference in the historiography in contemporary Mexico. Okay, to analyze this with this other perspective that has been neglected until now. So the time will come for our archive, for our report, and I feel like good with that. Not even though it was not acknowledged in the future, I think it will contribute a lot to understanding Mexican history. Thank you for
So that's why I think that your description of the report as a failure, it's not
in that sense.
It doesn't pay justice to your amazing work as that of the commissioners. It's really a great achievement, and I think that, as we were pointing out, it will last. The legacy of this report will last for many decades. But I want to take some more questions, and then yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Primero, segundo el agradecimiento. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and for doing this course in the first place. My sense is that violence from state was and still is also a systematic repression of justice efforts. So families looking for the desaparecidos, or in general looking for justice, have been facing systematic discrimination and repression from judiciary institutions. I think you mentioned a little bit about this in your last point, but my question is, were you able to track these cases? And if so, do you think the way that the state has oppressed, in this sense, like the mechanisms the state has used, has changed in any way in this period?
Let me provide you with a more abstract answer to a very good question. I truly believe that Mexico had the possibility in the year 2000 to start over, to start again, to focus again and to try to construct new institutions. But it didn't happen. The transition and the democracy in the year 2000 didn't want to look and to reconstruct how institutions were created. So how would you describe the nudos de impunidad, the institutions that are responsible for the impunity of today were the ones that were constructed in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And when in the year 2000 we had the possibility to change this, to reconstruct our judicial system, to reconstruct police, to reconstruct the fiscalía, to reconstruct all this stuff, we didn't want to do so. And we continue with the same institutional arrangements that are the ones that don't allow us to understand why human rights violations are happening now, and why we have 98% of impunity in Mexico now. But we had the chance to do so in the 2000, and that's why I think that the democracy actually failed in those terms in Mexico. The promise of democracy was not complied very much because the people at that point in the power didn't want to change and start over. So I to my eyes, I'm not sure if I was able to contact this idea. But the past is very much in the present, right? The institutional arrangements account for the problems in the present. And if we don't really look again to the past in order to reconstruct our present institutions, we will always continue having this stuff and these problems over and over and over. So we have to really try to reconstruct these institutions, not just in the state, but also the abogados, the Ministerios Públicos, the Fiscalías. All these institutions are also part of this, and they were created really in the 1970s, 1980s. The nudos de impunidad, no? To say the impunity of today, the impunity of yesterday is what allows impunity today in this.
Thank you for being here and sharing this with us. I had a question regarding all of like the bureaucratic restrictions and like roadblocks that you had the entire time. Like, given that experience, what do you think was like the real main motivation of the executive branch to kind of create this mandate in the first place?
This is a very interesting question. Obviously, the presidency of López Obrador was the first leftist government in power. Was supported by different human rights groups, including Rosario Ibarra, de Piedra, the founder of Eureka, one of the most relevant groups of mothers asking for their children, which were disappeared, to come again. So he was supported by leftist organizations that suffer a lot in the dirty war. And there was also a lot of pressure for him and for the subsecretary to start a truth commission and try to understand what happened there. So it was a lot of pressure from leftist groups, right? But that came in tension with the power of the army that he actually always also tried to support. So at some point, the two cars clashed, right? The support of the left and obviously the interest of President López Obrador to keep the support of the army. At some point in 2023, crash, and we were the victims of that crash. At the end, all these groups that were part of it felt also very much abandoned and feel that the promise was not completed, right? So it was the push from these leftist organizations that allowed the commission to be created.
So my question is about I suppose the parameters of your study. So you mentioned that you were looking at the types of violence carried out by the state against
by state actors.
Against insurgents, against those labeled as political dissidents. You also mentioned, however, that folks were targeted if they were seen as against implementation of certain economic policies. I'm curious if you encountered situations where corporate or private interests played a part in this, and I understand that could obfuscate or make it difficult to implicate the state in that. But there have to be situations, or I assume there are situations where private and corporate interests played a part in some way, and that was limiting for you guys because of the your scope, specific being on state action. So what is defined as state action? And so that's one of my questions. If and when did that happen? And then the second part, for those who would, ideally be doing future research on this and those things that could not be covered, would they be granted same access to the archives that for the first time you as the commission were granted?
These are great questions. Yeah. So also in more abstract terms, I personally was interested in understanding the conversation that the state had with society in general. That was my more methodological understanding of this. Was trying to understand the conversation, how actually reacted towards society movements in general state, whatever it is the state, right? So that's why we also studied, for instance, how police forces interacted with transsexual workers in Mexico City, and had some archives on that, and so on. And obviously, corporate interests and private corporations were a part of this. We follow the Brazilian Commission that actually studied a few years ago how Volkswagen and other enterprises or corporate interests play out into repression in Brazil in the dictatorship, and it actually growed a very interesting methodological way into approaching this. We didn't have time for that. We wanted to do so in our first plan, in our idea. This was also part of it. We didn't have time for that. We didn't have much information about that, so we didn't finish doing that research. But if you are interested into that, the Brazilian Commission actually did that, not just corporate interest, but also transnational interest, and how that play out with general repression. We were not able to do so. It's one of the failures of the state. If you want to see that, but this is super interesting as well.
Anyone else? Maite.
Thank you, Carlos, for
Gracias,
the
Maite.
absolutely amazing presentation, and my admiration, toda mi admiración por su trabajo. So I do have many questions. One is actually geared towards the scholarly community, and you went in many different archives. So I think what you did is also inviting UCLA to continue to do research. And I can imagine our students wanting to continue with that. How difficult is it to access the archives? And again, I know how it is when you do research and everything is scattered in different states all over, provincial archives, etc. That's one question. The other question, because I was a little bit late, why till the 90s and not beyond that? That follow-up question, do you think there's going to be another commission? And the other question is, what about studying it from the point of view of gender? You mentioned it at the very end that in Guerrero, women were not openly described as victims, which adds yet another dimension. So I do have more questions, but I don't have.
I hope we will have time to discuss it later on. Let me just concentrate the answer into the two first questions. Well, 1990s, again, it was a decision of the president. It was how the negotiation finished between guerrilla members and colectivos and the jurídico del Estado and the presidency. Obviously, they want to go further on, but the president didn't want to. They wanted to finish this in 1985. So at the end, 1965, 1990 was the suboptimal decision, but it was the decision to stop that. But obviously, as I showed with the PRD example, repression went also further on and started before 1965. So it was just a time frame that was imposed to us. I think that this commission was too costly to the bureaucracy in states. So I don't think that another one will follow from 1990 onwards. It was too costly. A lot of problems arising from this. So I think that it won't happen. I would obviously at the end in the recommendations, the first recommendation was to have to go further on from 1990 and to create local commissions as the one in Guerrero, because every region in Mexico has local specificities and should be going and researchers have to focus and narrow down their research. So it's more time and also more focus. It makes it very difficult to look at this archive. We have the possibility to send, I'm not lying here, at least 25 officios, daily officios to different archives in order to have access to them. They responded 2 weeks later, hey, you cannot. Of course I can because I'm part of the commission. So it was like the first 2 years was a negotiation with the archives in order to gain access to them. After these 3 years, we were able to open 22 archives that were not open at the very beginning when we started them. And we sent a lot of stuff to the National Security Archive in Washington. I'm not sure if you're aware of the existence of the National Security Archive. I forgot the name of the lady that works there, but they have been super supportive, and they are digitalizing a lot of stuff that we provide to them. So in the next months, in the next years, you will be able to access to them through the National Security Archive, and we are also giving the Colegio de Mexico all the documents that we found out over that period. The bad news here is that all this work of the gestión work that we actually did over this time will not continue because there is no one doing these gestiones that started with us and actually have not finished them, including the archivo del Poder Judicial de la Ciudad de México, including el archivo de la Policía de Chiapas, including the archivo de policías and justices that are super relevant for understanding not just human rights violations, but in general contemporary Mexico. So yeah, I think that the students will benefit from this work in the future. I'm also happy to receive emails and questions about this and to help other people to get access to them. This would be at the end the most relevant and the most satisfaction at the end of this work, that others continue studying this. Some people have done that in Mexico in the last months, and I always feel super happy when I know about someone that's actually trying to take one of the cases that we have there and really to study them and to give new light towards them.
What about the gender question?
The gender, it was like a wonder. I don't think I'm the one that should respond that, because we have specific a specific team working on that. In the case of like in a more concrete way, is trying to understand women not as indirect victims, but direct victims as well of repression. In most cases, as those who were murdered or those who were disappeared were men. But our understanding is when we interview their wife or their kids, understanding them not as indirect victims, but also as a direct one. And by doing that we were able to try to study all these cases across the board with a gender perspective.
I think we're running out of time. But quick last question. Sorry, Dulce. What are some of the recommendations in the report?
Wow. to have a new archive policy, for instance, that allows all these archives to be opened. Very important. Second, to reconstruct completely the sistema de reparaciones in Mexico, that, for instance, don't take into account all these indirect victims, but to include them. Also, some recommendations that went beyond our scope, mainly stop militarization of the country in terms that, obviously, when we continue to give power to the military, they will keep all these archives for themselves. At the end, I think we include 150 recommendations. Some were like very, very specific ones. No, for instance, we still have in Mexico streets and municipios named with the name of perpetrators. Calle Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, Luis Echeverría Álvarez, all of these guys. These guys have to have. There should not be streets and colonias named by them. And our dream when we're doing this, to have a special fiscalia for studying these cases again and try to go through these cases, because Alejandro Hertz Manero, who is Fiscal General de la República today, Fiscal General de la República, General Attorney in Mexico, has been General Attorney for the last 7 years. This guy was in charge of the Operación Condor in 1969, in 1978. 1978, he was in charge of Operation Condor. So many of the perpetrators of the perpetration of those days are still not just alive. They're still in relevant positions. So to construct and reconstruct this Fiscalía Especial to punish them would be a nice way to start.
Thank you so much.